now, as the final session of the morning, I'm really pleased to invite Kechur, Professor Roman Kechur, to give his presentation to us. He's head of the Department of Psychology and Psychotherapy at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and also a senior member of the Ukrainian Association of Psychotherapy. Roman, over to you.
Hello, dear colleagues. Can you see my presentation? You can see it, right? Great. Okay, so I tried to make this presentation. I will read more than I will speak because time matters. We do not have that much time, but it seems to me that we have to be very clear, very precise in some definitions, because here we have such a possibility to think about some situations we have never been before. At least our generation has never been in such situations. That's why we have to take into account ethical, legal, psychological factors of this war that we are currently in. I have prepared the presentation in 2 languages, so the interpreter will be interpreting, Anastasia will be interpreting, but you will be able to see the main statements on the screen and you will be able to read them. At the beginning, I would like to focus on the difference between ethical aspects of this discussion and legal ones, because it seems to me that in our contemplations we very often can confuse these 2 statements. So I will try to formulate clearly where are those boundaries between legal and ethical aspects. There are 3 categories of criminal acts that require proper legal assessment. The first one is the crime of aggression. Is the very attack on a sovereign state with the aim of seizing its territory and establishing control over it, erasing its cultural and national identity. The second is war crimes or crimes against humanity, persecution of the civilian population, mass murders, torture, sexual violence, mass relocation of Ukrainians to the territory of the Russian Federation, relocation of children from Ukraine and their subsequent adoption in inverted commas in the Russian Federation, attacks on energy infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And the third one is genocide and calls for it. Proclamation by Russian officials of the Ukrainian people as non-existent and the Ukrainian state as a failed state. These actions should receive appropriate legal qualification. So everything I have mentioned in these 3 points, it's not about ethical aspects, it's about legal aspects. So it presupposes that after the end of war, we will have court and trials, and we will have legal punishment of those who are to blame. We will focus on ethical systems, ethical aspects. The 2 ethical systems, according to Volodymyr Lefebvre. Volodymyr Lefebvre is the author of reflexive game theory. He has been working for a pretty long time in California, and he has formulated pretty interesting, as for me, concept that can be presented now to formulate a view on ethical problem. So there are 2 types of ethical systems according to Lefebvre. The first one is the prohibition of evil, and the other one is postulating of good. Well, as an example, we can take, for example, let's say 10, the biblical story, yes, not to kill, not to steal, yes. So basically, we are talking here about people, about society, how it should be in those 10 postulates from the Bible. The second system is postulating of good. It's something that actually can define what the person or society should be like. For colleagues from our European countries, it might be not very understandable example, but those of us who still believe, who still remember communist system, we had such preamble to the constitution, which was called ethical code of the builder of the communist. And there we have, it was written how the communist citizens should look like, and that is the typical totalitarian view on such system. Based on, according to Lefebvre, the difference between ethical systems stems from different answers to the fundamental questions. Can good be achieved through evil? That is, what is more important, the prohibition of evil or the achievement of good? And Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit defines the avoidance of evil rather than the pursuit of good, not only as an important ethical factor, but also a motivational one. Here, I would like to have go a little bit from this. To get aside from this text, Alexander Fields mentioned today ethical and moral, a difference between ethical and moral. So this Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, he says that ethical is used for our people and moral to others, to strangers. Ethical is used to those we have some ethical memory, memory of ethics together. So the circle of people who we treat as our people. So this conflict is possible between Ukrainian psychotherapists and the board of EAP. That's why we had this conflict, because we had different principles, ethical or moral, while assessing the situation we were in. Paradoxically, representatives of the first ethical system, I mean those who postulate prohibition of evil, they understand compromise as good, and representatives of the second one as evil. So Lefebvre came to the conclusion that in those cultural communities whose ethical systems prohibit evil, people strive for compromise. Their heroes are peacemakers, whereas in those communities in which ethics postulate good, compromise is not acceptable. For these people, their whole life is a struggle. During the conflict of those two ethical systems, sides can have absolutely a different approach to the conflict and to the desired ways of ending it. Representatives of the first ethical system, Western model, try to resolve the conflict through compromise, the German doctrine of trade not to fight, as opposed to the Russian doctrine, ultimatum of war. Moreover, the liberal ethical model assumes reaching a compromise as a desirable solution to the conflict. All wars end at the negotiating table, while the totalitarian one seeks to establish harmony. There are no Ukrainians. Those who consider themselves Ukrainians must be destroyed. If you destroy Ukrainians, then the harmony will come. And here we have the question to yet another fundamental question. Is it possible to be tolerant to intolerance? If we want real compromise, we must tolerate otherness, but by no means tolerate intolerance. The evil that recognizes itself as evil becomes good. Good that tolerates evil or intolerance becomes evil. Freud introduced the concept of neutrality into the psychoanalytic technique with the aim of objectifying the psychoanalytic process. Psychoanalytic interpretations should have the same weight as other medical conclusions. At the same time, the very subjective nature of the human psyche was ignored. In Freud's defense, one can only say that he abandoned the very possibility of an ethical assessment of symptoms. Instincts and drives are outside ethics, or rather to ethics. And more modern versions of psychoanalysis rely on therapeutic openness, vulnerability, and inclusion. From this, we can come to the conclusion that the very ability to think ethically implies the subjects belonging to one of the ethical systems. In other words, ethical judgment cannot be neutral. What war does to us? Trauma. What destroys us? Our homes, our cities, our well-being, our safety, our health, our life. War causes catastrophic effects that try to destroy our thinking. This terrible experience does not necessarily have to become trauma. Only when we face our own powerlessness and other people's indifference under the mask of neutrality. Neutrality towards mass violent crime, which is Russia's war against Ukraine, is a separate factor of traumatization. Intolerance of a fact cannot be explained by the intensity of painful experiences of a traumatic event. trauma is constructed in an intersubjective field where emotional pain cannot find appropriate understanding and empathy. Robert Stollerow. Now, just a small diversion, I will quote myself. I will quote my speech, which I gave 8 years ago in a roundtable discussion that took place in Vienna. It was called Crisis in Ukraine, a psychotherapeutic approach. It took place in Vienna on December the 5th and 6th, 2014. In the beginning, as I say, feet, let us mention Freud, and more specifically a story that relates him to Philip Holtzman. Philip Holtzman was the father of surrealism, a friend of Salvador Dali. In 1928, even before he became a famous photographer, he was convicted for 10 years for the murder of his father, a dentist, Mordecai Holtzman. He died during a tour in the Austrian Alps. He fell off the cliff. No one apart from his 22-year-old son saw this tragedy, but the court of Innsbruck found Philip guilty of murder. There was no factual proof for that, but the Holtzmans were Jewish and they were not Austrian citizens, while the Nazi ideology was already influencing all spheres of life, including justice. It looked like that was the reason for Holtzman's sentence. The case became a scandal. There were public protests against the prejudice of the court. Many celebrities, including Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann, voiced their support for Philip Holtzman. In 2 years, the guy was released, but they demanded for him to immediately leave the country. During the trial, the defense of Philip Holtzman made an unexpected move. The forensic psychiatric examination that was carried out at the medical faculty of the Innsbruck University considered the Oedipus complex found in the defendant to be the motive of the murder. On this basis, his lawyer demanded that the defendant be released from liability for the death of his father. Sigmund Freud put forward his critique of such approach. The founder of psychoanalysis did not see the connection between the Oedipus complex and pre-assumed patricide, because the Oedipus complex was always there, and therefore was not suited to solve the issues of guilt, could not be used for that. Thus, Freud established the intellectual boundary in an arbitrary speculative reasoning. The Oedipal conflict is there, but it is regarded as a generally human psychological background, not as a direct motive for murder. Let us go back to the crisis in Ukraine. It is the description from 8 years ago. Is there a conflict between the Russian world and the European vector? There surely is. This political and public discussion has been going on for many years. Two revolutions of 2004 and 2013 have become the quintessence of this confrontation of ideologies. Is it unique? Of course not. The examples of Catalonian Basque Scots Belgians come to mind. The difference of these conflicts from the Ukrainian one is in their location within the Western world, not on its border. They are not happening next to a stagnating empire keen on expanding its borders. An empire where compromise is believed to be an expression of weakness and any conflict is solved by annihilation of one of its parties. The modern Western tradition holds the conflict mainly in the form of a civilized discussion, attempting to find a source for development in the tension created by it. Possibly, that it's so difficult for us to understand the logic of the aggressor's actions. It's hard to understand. That's why we have to call these things their proper names. There is an ideological tension in Ukraine, as in many other countries. But this is the background, not the direct cause of killings. If we treat this conflict as a civil war and not as an armed aggression staged against the background of general public tension, then all our following conclusions will be a priori false. Just like the intrapsychic Oedipal conflict is neither reason nor excuse for real murder of a real father, the internal outlook crisis in Ukraine does not account for the real act of aggression on Russia's part, involving real saboteurs, real tanks, and all too real downed airliner. In the case of Holtzman, Freud outlined the difference between the mental and the legal. He understood it well. But do we understand it? I have this very long quotation to show that this discussion did not start 1 year ago, or it has not just started. We have been conducting this discussion for the very time we have Russian aggression on Ukrainian land. 9 years have passed since then. We hope to be understood at least now. Hannah Arendt on forgiveness, the impossibility of forgiving radical evil. In her writings, Arendt focuses on an attempt to understand the nature of evil, in particular what was committed in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany by the Nazi and Stalinist regimes. For Arendt, the totalitarianism of these regimes is a special kind of evil, a radical evil, or absolute evil. Radical evil can be understood as evil that is not motivated by any understandable human motives. Hannah Arendt points out that it is impossible to forgive radical evil because it is completely outside of humanity. According to Arendt, this evil is not motivated by understandable human motives. Radical evil is essentially about the dehumanization of human beings. The main phenomenon of radical evil, and at the same time its goal, is the humanization of human beings. According to Arendt, radical evil has two aspects. Radical evil goes beyond humanity and human understanding. One, human beings do not kill other human beings for human motives, but this is an organized attempt to destroy the concept of a human being. Jacques Derrida. That's just general final definition. Jacques Derrida believed that absolute evil is just an idea that people use to describe a state or action that exceeds the norms of ethics and morality. According to him, we should accept and include absolute evil in our thinking about morality and ethics because it is an essential part of our existence. Because it seems like we have found a name for this Russian war, absolute evil. Thank you for attention.
My dear Roman, thank you so much for your wisdom and for your insight and for your truth that you have spoken to us in this final presentation of the morning. You've gathered together a lot of the things that were said earlier and focused them, drawing on some really important examples and ending with absolute evil. Thank you for your words to us this morning. I'm going to close this morning session of the symposium, first of all, with thank yous, and then also just with some information about the groups after lunch. So I think from all of us, our first thank you is to our translator, Anastasia Kechur, who has worked throughout the morning translating all of these speeches from Ukrainian into English, from English into Ukrainian. Thank you so much for your work, Anastasia. You make it possible for us to communicate with each other. And this is so important at this time because that communication is part of our humanity and you are enabling it. So thank you so much for your work this morning, particularly because it's been hard work for you. And then my second thank you is to all of our speakers for everything that they have given to us, all that they have expressed, to take us absolutely to the heart of the war in Ukraine, the ways in which it's impacting on our sense of reality, on our sense of ethics, on our work and our values as psychotherapists. We've touched on so many aspects of this through all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone who has spoken. The afternoon session will begin at the time on the timetable. It means we have 35 minutes for lunch. That's good. Sadly, normally we would be able to talk over lunch, and that's one thing we can't do through Zoom. So I encourage you to eat slowly and savor your food as you reflect and digest everything that you've heard this morning, and we will begin the afternoon session at 1:30 Central European Time. Keep your contact with don't close down your Zoom, keep in contact with the symposium, close your video if you want to, and as you come back for the afternoon session, you will be placed in a discussion room with other people who are part of the symposium today. We're organizing it so that in every group there are Ukrainians and Europeans, so that we continue this important dialogue. And in each group, or in almost all of the groups, there will be a volunteer, thank you to the volunteers, who will be there to help with the translation from Ukrainian to English and back into Ukrainian. So I hope that your discussion groups are really rich and valuable. We encourage you to have a wide discussion about the presentations you've heard this morning, and then towards the end of your time, perhaps begin to identify 1 or 2 questions or comments that you want to make to the round table, that you can either speak in the round table because you will be able to, or put these in the chat at the time of the round table. So please let us know a little bit about what each of the discussion groups has been talking about. So I wish you a good lunch and see you at 1:30. Thank you so much, everyone.